Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are talking about combining the prayers, and Hadith 344, the statement of Abdullah ibn Abbas. He says that the Prophet combined the Dhuhr and Asr prayer and the Maghrib and Isha prayer in Al-Madinah without the reason of fear nor for the reason of rain. And he was asked, why did the Prophet do such a thing? And Ibn Abbas replied, so as not to put his ummah in any difficulty or hardship. So from this it becomes known to us that combining between the prayers is permissible due to a hardship. And in another narration in the same chapter, we find that Abdullah ibn Abbas was giving a talk or a khutbah to the people after the Asr Salaah, and the sun set and the stars appeared. In other words, the time of Isha started and they had not even prayed Salat al-Maghrib. And so a man from the tribe of Banu Tamim said, As-Salah, As-Salah. And Ibn Abbas replied, Atu'allimuni bis-Sunnah? Are you teaching me of the Sunnah? He says, I saw the Prophet combine between the Dhuhr and Asr and between the Maghrib and Isha prayers. So we find in this particular example, Abdullah ibn Abbas is giving a talk to the people and he is giving this precedence over the Salah. And so what he's going to do, he's going to delay the Maghrib up until Isha and combine them both. And it seems to us that this particular talk which he was giving to the people was an extremely important talk. And perhaps he felt that if they prayed the Maghrib on its proper time, then after Maghrib people would leave and not listen to the talk. So whilst he has got their attention, he'll keep their attention until the talk is finished, and then he can combine the Maghrib and the Isha, because the Maghrib would have been missed if he completes the talk. So we find that when it comes to difficult situations, whereby praying the prayer on its proper time would be awkward or cause some sort of difficulty, then it is permissible to combine between the prayers even if you are not traveling. And nowadays, in contemporary practical application, you could find that you're in a place in which you have to attend a particular lesson, and it would be difficult for you to leave this lesson because of the Salah. So here we say that you are allowed to combine between the prayers, because this is done for a genuine need. We can also say that if you have to give a long khutbah to a particular people for a particular need, then it can be so long so as to miss the Salah and then combine it with the second Salah, just like Ibn Abbas did here, miss the Maghrib and combined it with the Isha. So this is in a case if it is absolutely necessary to give a long talk. We can also take from this that fear and rain are valid reasons for combining the prayer, because the narration says that he combined it without any fear or any rain. So it means that if there was rain or if there was some fear, then you can combine it. The reason in the first narration which we read as to why the Prophet combined the prayer in Al-Madinah is likely to have been illness. Otherwise we can say that any valid reason would justify the combination of the prayer. So anything which causes genuine difficulty would justify the combination. Hadith 345. This is about when you leave the prayer, which way do you turn? Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anh was asked, how should I leave when I have finished praying? Should I turn to my right or to my left? And Anas replied, as for me, then the most I saw the Prophet, as he left the prayer, he would turn to his right. But in the same chapter, in another narration, Abdullah, another companion, says that the most he saw the Prophet, he would turn to his left as he left the prayer. So we find here there's a clear contradiction, but the way to resolve this apparent contradiction is simply to say that the Prophet would do this and that. So as you leave the prayer, you can turn to your right, and as you leave the prayer, you can also turn to your left. Hadith 346. From Al-Bara' ibn Azib, he says, we used to pray behind the Prophet, and we used to like being to his right-hand side, because after the prayer, he would turn to his right and face us. He says, I heard the Prophet say, رَبِّي قِنِي عَذَابَكَ يَوْمَ تَبْعَثُ أَوْ تَجْمَعُ عِبَادَكَ. My Rabb, save me from your punishment the day when you resurrect or collect together your servants. Now, what does this narration mean? Is it talking about after the Prophet says the salam and he turns to face the congregation? Or is it talking about the salam itself? In other words, he gives the salam on the right hand side first and then the left. Now what appears to be the case here is that it is talking about the salam itself, so that he gives the salam to the right hand side first, and so this is why the companions would prefer to be on the right hand side, so that they receive the salam first. And this just goes to show that the companions would be eager to attain goodness wherever it is found. Notice here that they would not perform any congregational dua. Al-Bara says that he heard the Prophet say, Rabbi qini adhabak yawma tab'athu ibadak. And clearly this is a dua. So this could be used as evidence that making dua after the salah is permissible. But even if we say it is permissible, we would say do it individually, don't do it in a congregational way, because the Prophet did not do this ever. And the normal recommended practice would be that if you want to make dua, then inside the salah is better to make dua than outside the salah. Because the Prophet instructed us that when you finish the tashahhud, then you can ask Allah whatever you want to. As for after the salah, then this is normally the time for dhikr of Allah, not dua. Hadith 347, praying a nafilah after the iqamah has been given. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَلَا صَلَاةَ إِلَّا الْمَكْتُوبَةِ. When the iqamah is given, there is no salah except for the obligatory salah, which is being established now. So we find from this that after the iqamah is given, you are not allowed to begin a nafilah salah. And that this salah, not only is it haram for you to do so, but it is null and void. The Prophet said, Man adraka raka'ata min as-salah, faqad adraka as-salah. Whoever catches one raka'ah of the salah, then he has caught the salah. So we can say that if you are praying a nafilah and the iqamah goes, then if you have completed one raka'ah of the salah, then your salah is valid and you have caught the nafilah, and you are allowed to go on and complete the prayer. If you have not caught one rak'ah of the nafilah salah, then if the iqamah goes, you just break off your nafilah and join the congregational prayer. Because the point is that if you began the nafilah before the iqamah, then your nafilah is valid. And if you caught one rak'ah of this nafilah, then you have caught the nafilah salah. So if that's the case, that it is valid and you've caught the salah, then you don't want to spoil this act of worship by breaking it off just like that. Rather, it is upon you to continue on and complete the act of worship. So the point is that continuing on something is stronger than beginning it. So if the iqamah goes on, whereas you're not allowed to begin the nafilah, if you had began it before the iqamah, then you are allowed to continue on with the nafilah. So notice the difference between beginning an act and continuing an act. Similarly, you're not allowed to put on perfume in the ihram. That is, after you enter the state of ihram. But if you had put on perfume before the ihram, and then you enter the ihram, do you have to take the perfume off? The answer is no. And in fact, it is the sunnah of the Prophet that he would put the perfume on his body and then enter the state of ihram. Whereas you cannot do that after you enter the state of ihram. So there's a difference between beginning an action and continuing on the action. But it ought to be said that if you are praying the nafilah and the iqamah goes, then you ought to shorten this nafilah and make it very succinct, so that you can catch the opening takbir with the imam. This will obviously be the better way, because then you've caught the nafilah and you've caught the salat al-jama'ah from the very beginning as well. In another narration of the same chapter, from Ibn Buhayna, he says that the iqamah for the salat al-subh was given, and the Prophet saw a man praying a nafilah whilst the mu'adhin was giving the iqamah, and the Prophet said to him, أَتُصَلِّي الصُّبْحَ أَرْبَعًا? Are you praying the salat al-subh as 4 raka'at? So obviously this is by way of rebuke, and we can take from this that the salat al-subh is 2 rak'at, because the Prophet is saying that how can you be praying it as 4, which means it's not normally 4, therefore it is 2. When the Prophet says إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ, when the iqamah has been given, is he talking about the beginning of the iqamah or at the end of the iqamah? Well, we say he's talking about the beginning of the iqamah. So when the mu'adhin begins to give the iqamah, then you're not allowed to start any nafilah prayer. And if at the beginning of the iqamah you have caught 1 rak'ah of the nafilah which you started to pray before the iqamah, then you have caught the nafilah salah in its proper time. Hadith 348. What one says when he enters the masjid. From Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, the Prophet said, إِذَا دَخَلَ أَحَدُكُمُ الْمَسْجِدَ فَلْيَقُلْ اللَّهُمَّ افْتَحْ لِي أَبْوَابَ رَحْمَتِكَ وَإِذَا خَرَجَ فَلْيَقُلْ اللَّهُمَّ إِنِّي أَسْأَلُكَ مِنْ فَضْلِكَ. When one of you enters the masjid, he should say, O Allah, open for me the doors of your mercy. And when he leaves, he should say, O Allah, I ask you from your bounty. So you enter the masjid with your right foot first, and you make this dua. Notice that it is not legislated to use the miswak when entering the masjid. This is only for when you enter the house, and that there can be no analogy made between the house and the masjid. You ask for the mercy of Allah when you enter the masjid, because the masjid is a place of mercy, where mercy and tranquility descend, of course. And when you are praying to Allah, performing your Salah, then it is seeking the mercy of Allah Jalla wa Ala. And when you leave the masjid, you leave with the left first, so that the right hand side stays in the masjid for longer, as it is the more honored side, and you ask Allah from His bounty, because the outside world is where you normally seek your provisions and livelihood. And so this is what you are asking Allah Jalla wa Ala for. So it is permissible to ask for the worldly benefits as long as they are halal, such as, for example, halal earning. The ruling on saying this dua, even though an order has been given, is that it is mustahab and not wajib, as this dua is from the etiquettes of the masjid. There are other versions of this dua as well, given in the books of the Sunan, but this is a nice, short and easy version to learn. Hadith 349, about the Tahiyyatul Masjid. From Abu Qatada, the Prophet said, إِذَا دَخَلَ أَحَدُكُمُ الْمَسْجِدَ فَلْيَرْكَعْ رَكْعَتَيْنِ قَبْلَ أَنْ يَجْلِسْ. When one of you enters the masjid, then let him perform 2 rak'at before he sits down. The order has been given here for the Tahiyyatul Masjid, or the greeting of the masjid prayer. And so most scholars say it is mustahab, but some say it is wajib. And this is likely to be the better opinion, that it is wajib and not mustahab. What further shows us that it is wajib is that the Prophet ﷺ even ordered a man who came on Yawm al-Jum'ah to pray the Tahiyyatul Masjid first and then sit down, despite the fact that it is obligatory to listen to the Imam when he's giving the khutbah on the Jum'ah day. But still the Prophet told him to interrupt his listening of the khutbah and pray the Tahiyyatul Masjid, which means that it is more than just recommended, it has to be wajib. Because only one wajib can counteract another wajib. Those who say it is mustahab, they will rely on the general evidence about the A'rabi asking the Prophet what is wajib, and amongst the other things, he says that the 5 times prayer. The A'rabi asks anything else, and he says, no, except if you want to perform some optional actions. So the Tahiyyatul Masjid was not mentioned amongst the 5 times prayer. But we can say that this type of prayer, which is wajib, what the Prophet was talking about, are the regularly occurring prayers, the periodic prayers. It is not referring to those prayers for which there is a particular sabab or a particular cause. Otherwise, according to the correct opinion, Salat al-Kusuf is wajib because it has a particular sabab or a particular cause. So therefore, we find that this evidence of the majority is not a very strong evidence. So for example, if somebody made a vow, or nadhr, that he is going to perform a prayer, do we say this is obligatory upon him? We say yes, it's obligatory, even though it's not from the 5 times prayer. But this is a prayer for which there is a particular sabab. What if you enter the masjid, you pray your Tahiyyatul Masjid, and then you have to leave for a short period of time? When you come back in, do you have to do it again? Well, the answer is no. So for example, if you're a mu'takif, and you have to exit the masjid to go to the lavatory, then you're going to come back shortly. Do you have to perform the Tahiyyatul Masjid? The answer is no. It is only when you leave for a long period of time. What about the Al-Masjid Al-Haram? If you go into the masjid and you want to sit down, then even in the Masjid Al-Haram you would have to perform the Tahiyyatul Masjid. There's no exception here. But if you are going to go in for the tawaf, then some ulama say that if you perform the tawaf, this will serve as the Tahiyyatul Masjid so that you can sit down without performing the 2 rak'at. However, if somebody makes the tawaf and then the 2 rak'at afterwards, before sitting down, then this will be better. He could even combine it with the 2 rak'at to be prayed at the Maqam Ibrahim, which are the 2 rak'at of the tawaf. So if he makes the 2 rak'at of the tawaf, then this will serve as his Tahiyyatul Masjid as well, because it is permissible to combine the intention. Similarly, if you go to the masjid and you want to pray the Salat al-Dhuhr, now before Dhuhr you're going to pray 2 rak'at of the Sunnah. Now this intention, you can combine it with the intention of the Tahiyyatul Masjid, because the point is that you don't sit down before you have prayed 2 rak'at. Now these 2 rak'at could be any 2 rak'at, whether it be the 2 rak'at of the tawaf, or the 2 rak'at of the Dhuhr Ratibah, or the 2 rak'at of the Salat al-Subh Ratibah, the Fajr. Another issue on this topic is, what about 1 rak'at? Can you do 1 rak'at before sitting down? Or is it precisely 2 which is intended? So for example, let us suppose you have not prayed the Salat al-Witr, and you enter the masjid and you pray the Witr, which is 1 rak'ah, you do it. Can you sit down now? Well, if we take the zahir of this hadith, then the matter is clear. You do not sit down until you have prayed 2 rak'at. But if we take another approach to this hadith and we say that what's intended here is not the 2 rak'at per se, so not the number per se, but rather that you offer a prayer before sitting down just as a respect and a veneration to the masjid. And this could be done with 1 rak'ah. And the only reason the Prophet says 2 rak'at is because this is most common. It is not common at all that anybody is going to come into the masjid and pray 1 rak'ah. But in theory, if it was to happen, and it may well happen, then this would be permissible. So it depends how you look at it. Do you look at the zahir or the apparent wording, or do you look at the underlying meaning? It appears to us, and Allah knows best, that even if you prayed 1 rak'ah, then you would have greeted the masjid and shown your veneration. Hadith number 350, about the recommendation of praying 2 rak'at in a masjid when you return from a travel. The statement of Jabir ibn Abdullah, he says that the Prophet bought a camel from me, and when he arrived in Al-Madinah, he ordered me to go to the masjid and to pray 2 rak'at. Also in the chapter from Ka'b ibn Malik, he says that the Prophet would never return home back from a journey except during the daytime, in the forenoon. And when he would return in the forenoon time, he would begin by going to the masjid and praying 2 rak'at there, and then he would sit down in it. These narrations talk about a sunnah which is forgotten. You simply don't find anyone practicing this, which is an immense shame. So, it is upon those who have knowledge, O listener, akramakallah, to give life to this sunnah, to practice it and teach it. So the lesson is, when you return from a journey, that you begin with the masjid and you pray 2 rak'at there. And this shows the great concern the Muslim has for the masjid, that his heart is always attached to the masjid. And praying 2 rak'at there would serve as a thanksgiving to Allah Jalla wa Ala for returning you back home safely. We can also take from the narration that when the Prophet would return from the journey, it would normally be in the forenoon, not during the afternoon, nor during the night. Hadith 351, about the Salat al-Duha. Aisha radiallahu anha was asked, did the Prophet used to pray Salat al-Duha? And she replied, no, except when he would return from a journey. In the same chapter, Aisha is asked, did the Prophet used to pray Salat al-Duha? And she replied, أربع ركعات ويزيد ما شاء. 4 rak'at he would pray, and he would increase on that as much as he wants to. And in another wording it says, وَيَزِيدُ مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ, and he would increase whatever Allah wants to increase. In another narration from Abdurrahman ibn Abi Layla, he says, no one informed me that the Prophet prayed Salat al-Duha except Hani. She is the sister of Ali ibn Abi Talib. He says that she informed me that the Prophet entered her house on the day of the Fath Makkah and he prayed 8 rak'at. She says, I never saw him pray a lighter prayer than that before, except that he used to fully complete the ruku' and the sujood. So he would do it fully, but it was done concisely at the same time, so not too lengthened. In another narration of the chapter, the Prophet was taking a bath on the day of the Fath Makkah, and Fatima, his daughter, was covering him with some cloth, and Hani entered and she gave the salam, and the Prophet asked, Man hadihi, who is this? And she said, Hani bint Abi Talib. And the Prophet said, Marhaban bi Hani, welcome Hani. When he finished the bathing, he stood up and prayed 8 rak'at whilst being wrapped with 1 item of clothing. And when he finished, she said to him that her brother, Ali ibn Abi Talib, is going to kill a man that I have given protection. And the Prophet told her, قَدْ أَجَرْنَا مَنْ أَجَرْتِ يَا Hani. We have given protection to whomsoever you have given protection, O Hani. And all of this took place at the Duha time. Hadith 352, also on the Salat al-Duha, from Abu Dharr. The Prophet ﷺ said, يُصْبِحُ عَلَى كُلِّ سُلَامَ مِنْ أَحْدِكُمْ صَدَقَةٌ فَكُلُّ تَسْبِيحَةٍ صَدَقَةٌ وَكُلُّ تَحْمِيدَةٍ صَدَقَةٌ وَكُلُّ تَهْلِيلَةٍ صَدَقَةٌ وَكُلُّ تَكْبِيرَةٍ صَدَقَةٌ وَأَمْرٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ صَدَقَةٌ وَنَهْيٌ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ صَدَقَةٌ وَيُجْزِئُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ رَكْعَتَانِ يَرْكَعُهُمَا مِنَ الضُّحَى. Every morning there is obligatory for every joint of one of you to give sadaqah. So every tasbih, tahmeed, tahleel and takbir is sadaqah, and enjoining the good and forbidding the evil is sadaqah. But just 2 rak'at at the time of duha would suffice all of that. Hadith 353, the statement of Abu Hurairah, He says, أوصاني خليلي بثلاث بصيام 3 أيام من كل شهر وركعتي الضحى وأن أوتر قبل أن أرقد. He says that my close and pure friend advised me to perform 3 actions: to fast 3 days every month, to pray 2 rakat of duha, and that I should make Salat al-Witr before I go to sleep. So all of these narrations which you have heard are pertaining to the Salat al-Duha. The first narration from Aisha tells us that he would not pray Salat al-Duha except when he would return from a journey. Now we know he would normally return at Duha time, so this prayer which he would pray appears to be Salat al-Duha, which would then mean that the previous narration in the other chapter about returning from a journey and praying the 2 rakat in the masjid, could this be referring to a simple Salat al-Duha as opposed to a particular prayer of returning from the journey? That is possible. And if we say that is a Salat al-Duha, then it means it is not legislated to make this prayer of 2 rakat in the masjid if you arrive in your hometown by night time or in the afternoon, because of course that is not the time of Salat al-Duha. So you can interpret it either way. You could say that this is a prayer specific for returning from a journey, in which case it is to be performed at any time, or you could interpret it the other way, that this is a Salat al-Duha, therefore only to be performed at Duha time. But the Salat al-Duha is a nafilah, so why would you do it in the masjid? A nafilah is better to be prayed at home, is it not? It appears that that prayer, therefore, is specific for when you return from a journey, that you should go into the masjid and pray 2 rakat. As for the narration on Salat al-Duha, then Aisha says that the Prophet would not pray it, and so there would be times when he does not pray Salat al-Duha. So he would not always be praying Salat al-Duha, and in the other narration she says that he would pray 4 rakat and would increase as much as he wants to, and in another wording, he would increase as much as Allah wants him to. So that tells us that he would pray duha. So we can say sometimes he would not, and sometimes he would pray duha. As for when the timing of the duha begins, then it is when the sun rises 1 spear length above the horizon, up until it is 1 spear length before its zenith. And the better time for Salat al-Duha is during the later time, when it heats up. We can say, taking the last narration, that Salat al-Duha is a continuous sunnah to be performed, because for every joint you should give a charity, and this could be done in many ways, but the easiest way is to perform 2 rakat only of Salat al-Duha. So this proves that this is a sunnah which can be performed every day, but we say it is more emphasized to perform it if you have not performed the Salat al-Tahajjud, because normally the Prophet would perform the nighttime prayer, and so he would not do it in the forenoon. But as for if you have not performed the nighttime prayer, then it is more emphasized for you to do it in the forenoon, which is the Salat al-Duha time. We can also find that there is no upper limit on the Duha prayer, because Aisha says he would pray 4 and it would increase as much as Allah wanted to, or as much as he wanted to. Some scholars say the maximum to be prayed is 8, and they take the evidence from the narration of Hani, that the Prophet prayed 8 rakat during the Duha time on the day of the Fath Makkah. But of course this is no evidence. It does not say that the maximum to be prayed is 8. Rather, at best we can say that on that particular day the Prophet prayed 8, that's it. We cannot take any more than that. And some scholars say that that prayer of 8 rakat was a prayer for conquering the land. And so they would say that the leader ought to pray a prayer for conquering the land if the Muslim army conquers the Kafir land. Notice also in that narration, the Prophet is taking a bath and still he speaks to Hani. And so we find it is permissible to talk to somebody else whilst taking a bath. But the Prophet forbade talking to someone else whilst relieving yourself, because Allah Jalla wa Ala hates that. We can also take that a woman is allowed to protect somebody from the non-Muslims during times of battle, and that the leader would have to respect this, because the Prophet protected whomsoever Hani protected, and so therefore Ali radiallahu anh was prevented from killing this man. We can also take that you're allowed to pray using just 1 item of clothing, as the Prophet did here, and whatever applies to a nafilah applies to a fard, except if you have evidence. Also we can take that you're allowed to speak to a non-mahram woman, because Hani is not a mahram to the Prophet, she is his cousin. So you can speak to a non-mahram woman for a genuine need, but not if there is no genuine need. The particular virtue of Salat al-Duha is that it comes at a time when normally people are busy with their work. So the amount of people who will be praying at that particular time would be very few. So this makes it a tricky time to pray because you're so busy. And the trickier the time is, the more virtuous it is. This is why Salat al-Asr has been given a particular mention out of all the 5 prayers because it comes at a tricky time. Likewise with the Salat al-Tahajjud, it's at a time when most people are sleeping. So if you can be one of those rare people who are up at that time praying, then this is yet more virtuous. And Salat al-Duha then is similar. Therefore you see that it has much reward and much virtue in that it forms as a sadaqah for every joint of yours. Imagine life without joints. You would not be able to move. You would be very much like a tree. We also take from the statement of Abu Hurairah that the Salat al-Duha is a regular sunnah to be performed, because this is what the Prophet ordered Abu Hurairah to do, as well as fasting 3 days every month. And we can also find from his statement that the Salat al-Witr can be performed before you go to sleep if you are unable to wake up during the latter part of the night. So this is all permissible. Fasting the 3 days in a month, which 3 days are these? Well, they are any 3 days, but the best of them would be the Ayyamul Bid, the days of the whiteness, and these are the 13th, 14th and 15th of every lunar month. Hadith 354, about the 2 sunnah of the Fajr, from Mu'mineen Hafsa. She said, when the mu'adhin would finish from the adhan of the Salat al-Subh, the Prophet would pray 2 light raka'at before the fard prayer was established. Also in the chapter from Aisha, she says that the Prophet would pray the 2 raka'at of Fajr and he would make it so light that I would ask myself, has he even recited the Fatiha? Also from her, she says that for no other nafilah prayer would the Prophet be so eager to pray it except for the 2 rak'at of the subh, meaning the sunnah prayers. Also from her, the Prophet ﷺ said, Rak'at al-Fajr khayrun min ad-dunya wa ma fiha. The 2 rak'at of Fajr are better than this whole world and whatever is in it. And in the chapter from Abu Hurairah, he says that the Prophet would recite in the 2 rak'at of Fajr, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ and قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. So these are the 2 surah to be recited in the rak'atay of Fajr. And this is a sunnah, not fard. From Ibn Abbas, he says that the Prophet would pray in the 2 rak'at of Fajr. In the first one, قُولُوا آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْنَا, ayah 136 of Al-Baqarah. And in the second one, آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَاشْهَدْ بِأَنَّا مُسْلِمُونَ, ayah 52 of Ali Imran. And in another wording it says, in the first one it would be قُولُوا آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْنَا, and in the second one, تَعَالَوْا إِلَى كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ. It's ayah 64 in Ali Imran. So these narrations prove that you pray 2 rak'at sunnah of Fajr before the fard prayer of the subh, and that the forbidden time for the prayer begins after the fard prayer, not after the dawn break. Also we take that this is a light prayer, so that if somebody wants to lengthen it, we say you have opposed the sunnah. And it would be no good for him to say, but I want to recite more, so I can gain more reward. We say, it is more worthy to follow the sunnah. And also we learn something of what you should recite in these 2 rak'atain. Of course this is not by way of obligation, it's by way of recommendation, but the Prophet would recite the 2 ikhlasain, the 2 surah of ikhlas. And also we learn that he would recite just from the middle of the surah, from Surah Al-Baqarah and from Surah Ali Imran. And this proves that you are allowed to recite just from the middle of the surah without beginning the surah in your recitation. So it doesn't have to be from the start of the surah, it could be just from the middle of the surah. So the matter is flexible, but the normal practice is to complete a surah after the Al-Fatiha. This sunnah of the Fajr can also be prayed during a journey, and he would do this, but the other rawatib nawafil prayers he would not pray on a journey. There is something extra special about the 2 rak'at of the Fajr, and of course we find that it is better than this whole world and whatever is in it. Hadith 355, about the rawatib prayers, from Habiba, that the Prophet said, من صلى 12 ركعة في يوم وليلة بني له بهن بيت في الجنة. Whoever prays 12 rak'at in a night and day, a house is built for him thereby in Jannah. And in another wording, من صلى في يوم 12 سجدة تطوعا بني له بيت في الجنة. Whoever prays 12 rak'at voluntarily in a day, then a house is built for him in Jannah. This is talking about the rawatib prayers, and we know from Sunan at-Tirmidhi what these prayers are because it's been expounded: 2 before the Salat al-Subh, 4 before the Dhuhr and 2 afterwards, 2 after the Maghrib, and 2 after the Isha. What is apparent from the narration is that if you pray these 12 in one day, a house is built for you in Jannah, so that you can bank many houses in Jannah by performing 12 rak'at every day. Also in the chapter from Ibn Umar, he says, I prayed with the Prophet 2 rak'at before the Dhuhr and 2 afterwards, 2 rak'at after Maghrib and 2 after Isha, and after the Salat al-Jum'ah 2 rak'at. As for the Maghrib and Isha and the Jum'ah, I prayed these with the Prophet in his house. So here he mentions 2 before the Dhuhr and not 4 before the Dhuhr. So you could pray 2 as well before the Dhuhr if you want to. However, the virtue of the house pertains to 4 before the Dhuhr. So this would be better. We can take from this narration that it is permissible to perform the Nafila prayer in congregation, because this is what Ibn Umar says, is that he performed the Rawatib prayers in Jama'ah with the Prophet. However, we say that this should not be a regular practice so that it resembles a Fard prayer. Rather, it should be a one-off practice. But in any case, the most important lesson to take is the virtue of these Rawatib Sunan. These are the fixed Sunnah prayers, and they are much more emphasized than any other Nawafil prayers. Hadith 356. From Aisha, she says the Prophet would pray as he was sitting, and when he wanted to make a ruku', he would stand up to the extent of about 40 ayat, and then make the ruku'. And in another narration she says that for many nights he would pray standing up, and for many nights he would pray sitting down. If he prayed standing up, he would make the ruku' standing up, and if he prayed sitting down, he'd make the ruku' sitting down. And in the same chapter, from Aisha, she says when the Prophet became older, and so his body became heavier for him, then most of his prayers were done sitting down. So we find from this that it is permissible to pray the Nawafil prayers sitting down, for example during the night, and then if you want to make the ruku', you can stand up if you have the energy to do so. If you do not have the energy to do so, you can make the ruku' sitting down, and you'd have to do this by way of indication. As for the Fard prayer, you must begin it standing up. And so when the Prophet became older and he put on a bit more weight, it was more difficult for him to keep standing up for a long period of time, so he would sit down. As for the Fard prayer, if you're able to begin the Fard prayer standing up, then this is what you should do. If you're unable to begin the Fard prayer standing up, then you should sit down. As for if the Imam is praying and you're praying behind him and he begins the prayer sitting down, then you begin the prayer sitting down, even if you are able to stand up. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. After saying the Salam, what is the Sunnah for the Imam to do? Question number 2. What Sunnah did we discuss pertaining to returning from a journey? Question number 3. What is the ruling of Salat al-Duha?